Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Erasing Rohingya, Genocide and Identification Documents in Myanmar with John Quinley of Fortify Rights. My name is Megan Reed and I am the Operations Coordinator for the Zorian Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This is the third session of Zorian Institute's third consecutive Genocide and Human Rights webinar series. These 5-part series are hosted by talented scholars and specialists in the field and cover a wide range of conceptual themes and specific case studies of genocide. The best part is they are open and accessible to the public, and you can tune in from home. In addition to today's highly anticipated session, we also have two more must-see webinars coming up in this month. Next week's session will focus on trauma and aftermath of genocide using testimony of genocide survivors. And our final session is on genocide and international accountability. And my colleague Jenna will be sharing the webpage to learn more and how to register in the chat box for these upcoming sessions. So a few housekeeping items before I give our host a proper introduction. If you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand to ask your question out loud. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation so we can address all the questions you have. And if you have any specific questions for the Institute, you're welcome to send me an email to admin@genocidestudies.org. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, John Quinley. He's joining us bright and early today. He's a senior human rights specialist with Fortify Rights, focused on the human rights situation of Rohingya in Myanmar and Bangladesh. He's also been with Fortify Rights since 2016, and he previously worked with the Women's Opportunity Resource Center in Philadelphia and with Partners Relief and Development in Shan State, Myanmar. He's an alum of the Zorian Institute's International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies here in Canada, and he holds an MA from the School of Politics and International Relations at Nottingham University in the UK, and a BA from Eastern University in the United States. He's written for Time, Financial Times, and the Overseas Development Institute, and others. So John, thank you so much for joining us this morning for you, and for this exciting presentation we have today.
Thank you, Megan, and for everyone joining. Thank you for taking the time today. I know it's your evening time or different times around the world, so I appreciate you all joining. I want to also thank the Zorian Institute for hosting the event and for bringing on a lot of people to talk about different genocide prevention measures and atrocity crime prevention. So it's an honor to speak to you all today. I'm going to share my PowerPoint and we can get started. I think it will be about 20 minutes of me speaking, and then hopefully after that we can have some question and answers. I'll do a little bit of PowerPoint presentation, then we'll watch a short clip, and then I'll do a little bit more PowerPoint, and then we'll go straight to Q&A for the interesting part. So thank you guys. I'll just share my screen really quickly here. So today we're going to be talking about Myanmar and the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Many of you know that right now Myanmar just underwent a military coup. On February 1st, the government took over. I'm going to put in my headphones because it's getting very loud, the cicadas. Myanmar just had a military coup. So General Min Aung Hlaing took over the government on February 1st of this year. When he took over in a military coup, he jailed and imprisoned the president of Myanmar and the state councillor, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. And he's also detained more than 2,000 political prisoners, leaders, political activists, leaders, journalists, and others. So right now, Myanmar is definitely in the headlines. But we're going to focus particularly on the Rohingya in northern Rakhine State and how citizenship and identity links to genocidal processes and how those two concepts interplay. So Fortify Rights, the organization I work for, we do kind of three main things. We investigate human rights violations. So that's independent research into human rights violations that are ongoing or happening. We write reports, press releases, write internal briefings, and we use those reports and those investigations to engage people of power. So we're meeting those people to try to change laws, policies, and practices and bring them in line with international standards. The third kind of area where we work is strengthening. So that's workshops, technical support for human rights defenders. So in my role, I mostly work with Rohingya in Bangladesh or in Myanmar to provide that technical support, that strengthening and capacity building in country. So today we're mostly going to be talking about the investigation side of things, the research that we've done over the last few years related to citizenship and the Rohingya. As many of you know, the Rohingya are an ethnic and religious minority in Myanmar. They primarily come from Rakhine State, Myanmar, which borders Bangladesh, and have experienced state-sponsored persecution for many years. This includes restrictions on marriage, restrictions on childbirth, restrictions on freedom of movement, on access to livelihood. And today what we'll be talking about is restrictions on the right to citizenship and nationality that the Rohingya people have experienced. When we look at the way that governments act around the world, and sometimes bad governments use administrative measures to try to oppress their own people. The UN Office of Genocide Prevention kind of outlines a number of these indicators that may lead to atrocity crimes in the future. Atrocity crimes meaning crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, the crime of aggression. When the Office of the UN Office of Genocide Prevention, they outline a number of indicators. So one of them would be the increased politicalization of identity, and you definitely see this happening amongst the Rohingya people. The second is discriminatory measures or legislation that is put in place by the government or in this case, the military now, to try to strip the population of their rights. So in the Rohingya case, there's been this kind of citizenship scrutiny process over many, many years and under many, many governments. This happened under both elected governments and military governments. So these citizenship scrutiny processes have been focused towards the Rohingya in Rakhine State and not necessarily other populations. These citizenship processes we found, and we outline it in our report called Tools of Genocide, which we can share later. They basically limit rights for Rohingya people. The most recent identity document or citizenship scrutiny process that has been implemented by the government is called the National Verification Card process, what is known as the NVC. The NVC was put in place right before the National League for Democracy came to power in 2015. And the NLD under Aung San Suu Kyi tried to move forward the NVC process. The NVC does not allow Rohingya people to recognize themselves as Rohingya. They have to register as Bengali or other foreign identities. And what some of our research found was this is actually a form of kind of administrative erasing of the population. And I'll go more into that later. But the government basically started asking Rohingya to take the NVC and to recognize themselves as foreigners who came from Bangladesh. This is a narrative that the government has been pushing for a long time, that Rohingya are Muslims and they're not actually a part of the Burman majority, that they're a different religion, a different ethnic group, and that they've actually come in from Bangladesh and trying to overtake our land. And so these narratives have been propagated by both democratically elected governments in Myanmar and also military juntas.
Sorry to interrupt. We're wondering if there's any way to reduce the cicada noise in the background. I don't know if there's another way.
Not right now. It's
no, okay.
Like, I live in a bit of a rural area.
That's okay. That's okay. Just wanted to double check.
Sorry, everyone, about the cicadas. I hope they will end soon. Hopefully you can hear me. I apologize. Yeah, so the research that we undertook and we published in 2019 consists of about 600 interviews, and about half of those were with women. We did both qualitative and quantitative research methodologies. My work was mostly the qualitative research, so long form interviews, 2 or 3 hours long with people. But we started with the quantitative research. We started with the participatory research process in the Cox's Bazar district, Bangladesh refugee camps. And my research with Fortify Rights mostly was conducted in 2018 and 2019, but the research in the report goes all the way back to 2014. We also did some interviews in Malaysia, which has a large Rohingya diaspora population, and many refugees have fled to Malaysia over the years. So just a small snapshot of some of the quantitative data that we collected. We did 495 surveys amongst Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, asking them about the long-term human rights violations that they had experienced. That survey was really in-depth, but some of the content that is applicable to our conversation today was we found that 100% of those people surveyed said that they were denied documentation or the ability to get further documentation inside Myanmar. And that's one of the reasons why they fled. 99.8% of them said that they were coerced at times to take ID documents, and 100% of them were denied full citizenship rights under the 1982 citizenship law in Myanmar. So we found these high numbers of kind of restrictions experienced around the right to nationality. So we decided to kind of look more into the national verification process and how that was implemented in Rakhine State. At this point, no one had done human rights research related to it. There had been some academic publications, but we wanted to come at it from a human rights perspective and look at it under international law. So that's when a lot of my research started in 2018, 2019, and that's what we'll be talking about mostly from here on out. But this participatory survey was really what informed writing the report and why we decided to take up the national verification card issue and try to change that process inside Myanmar. It will become a lot harder to change the process in Myanmar now that it's led by a military government, but we're gonna still try our best. So like I said before, the main human rights violation that we found occurred was restrictions on the right to nationality or citizenship. So the NVC does not confer citizenship under the 1982 law. So you would be scrutinized and apply for the NVC. A Rohingya would get an NVC card, and then they would have to go again and apply as not actually a Rohingya. So when they apply for NVC, they'll have to put Bengali. So then they'll have to go apply under the 1982 citizenship law as a different ethnicity or as basically a foreigner. So they would not be granted full citizenship in Myanmar. The Myanmar 1982 citizenship law is super problematic, and we go into great detail about the problems with the law. One of the main problems with the 82 law is that it has a hierarchy of citizenship and tiers of citizenship. So Rohingya are not granted what we consider as full citizenship under the 82 law. They would be able to get either naturalized citizenship or associate. But those two categories are not sustainable solutions for the Rohingya because under the law, those two categories can be stripped at any time by the state. And so once you become a citizen, all of a sudden you can actually be stripped of your right to citizenship if you're the two lower categories. So we've been calling for the government to amend the 1982 citizenship law and bring it in line with international standards and norms. But that's a really big problem in Myanmar is this law. And the NVC makes it that Rohingya cannot actually apply for this full citizenship category. There's a list in Myanmar of about over 100 ethnicities. And if you don't match those ethnicities, you're not granted citizenship in Myanmar. And a Rohingya person would not match one of those citizenship categories. And the NVC strips them of the ability to do that. because they can only label as Bengali, Pakistani, India, basically foreigners that are coming from the outside back into Myanmar. They cannot recognize themselves as indigenous to the state of Arkhan, or Rakhine as it's called now. Yeah, so that's the main human rights violation, and there's corresponding violations that go alongside the government's process to make the Rohingya people take NVCs. So one thing that we found is the government would go village to village and talk to village administrators and Rohingya people in their homes, and they would try to get them to take the NVC. We documented situations of beatings in order to get people to accept NVCs in northern Rakhine State, in Butidong, Ratidong, and Mungdaw townships. We also documented threats towards Rohingya people if they did not accept the NVC. This is happening as far back as 2015, these beatings or threats that Rohingya basically experienced from state security forces. Myanmar authorities, in the lead up to the major atrocity crimes that took place in 2016 and 2017, also at gunpoint made Rohingya to take NVCs. We documented most of this kind of violence, this military gunpoint violence, in 2016. From October 2016 till about August 2017. This is when that kind of force was used by police, border guard authorities, and the military in Rakhine State. Another area we looked at is the restrictions on the right to freedom of movement and livelihoods. So the government in Myanmar, when they put in place the NVC campaign, they said that the NVC would allow more freedom of movement. There's many government statements, government spokespeople that have talked about this publicly. They've said, if you take the NVC, you'll be granted the ability to move between township and township. You'll be able to go to the capital city. You'll be able to maybe get a passport and leave the country. So they basically offered up freedom of movement as a hopeful sign that the NVC could have for the Rohingya people. What our research found is actually people that took the NVC and people without the NVC actually had a lot of problems traveling, both categories. We interviewed people with the NVC and without. People even that took the NVC and had to recognize as another ethnicity, not Rohingya, they would go through checkpoints and still be extorted. They would still be threatened. They would still be made to come out of the car, and at times even detained. And so the human rights abuses and the intimidation and persecution that Rohingya face at these checkpoints did not actually change very much, whether they took the NVC or did not. Another big propaganda campaign that the government led was, if you take the NVC, you're going to be able to access livelihoods and businesses in ways that you never have before. And unless you have an NVC, we won't give you a fishing permit, or we won't let you allow you to operate a business in places like Mungdaw Township. So we went and interviewed a lot of Rohingya people that owned businesses, and we found that it also doesn't necessarily give you the ability to do business without restrictions as well. Rohingya fishermen that we talked to in central Rakhine State, particularly in Sitwe, people with the NVC and without it still had problems getting fishing permits, still were extorted by authorities, even if they had the NVC. It did in other parts of Myanmar, not central Rakhine State, but in northern Rakhine State, it did give some flexibility to be able to operate businesses like cell phone shops and timber businesses, stuff like this. But the Rohingya basically were forced into taking the NVC because they were worried about putting food on the table for their family. I actually interviewed a Rohingya man I'll read a quote from him. He was a Rohingya fisherman, and that was 30 years old, and he was trapped in an internment camp in central Rakhine State in Sitwe. There's more than 20 internment camps that were put in place by the government after 2012. And this man was in an internment camp, and he said, taking the NVC was the only way I could feed my children. And he went on to talk about why he took the NVC, why he was still able to fish in some capacity, but why he really didn't want to have to take the NVC because he wanted to still identify as Rohingya. But it was the only means he saw to be able to go out and do his livelihood that he'd done for many, many years, which was fishing off of Sidway, a city. The final area we looked at was the linkages between the mass atrocity crimes that happened, and many of you know about, against the Rohingya and the NVC process. We have a totally different research project on the preparations for genocide and crimes against humanity that took place between 2016 and 2017. There is a lot of documentation that there was intent to destroy the population in whole or in part in 2016 and 2017. The fact-finding mission, which was mandated by the United Nations, found that there was reasonable grounds to believe that genocide occurred inside Myanmar. And that report came out a little bit after this report. So yeah, we looked into the atrocity crimes. This research doesn't look into the violence, the killings, the genocidal rape, the arson and the burning of villages and other things. This report looks at citizenship, but we tried to, at the end of the report, kind of link the two together and see if there was overlaps. One thing that we found was in the weeks and months leading up to the violence in October 2016, there was a major campaign by state security forces going to villages, talking to village administrators, and trying to get them to force people to accept the NVC. And they told these people, if you do not accept the NVC, we will come to your village and we will attack your village, or we will kill your people. This is something that the village administrators told us about. There was many of these meetings in different townships and different villages across northern Rakhine State. And this was a major, I think, factor and interplay that was a part of the mass atrocities that actually isn't talked about as much, as this kind of lead up and this forcing of people to not recognize as Rohingya. The fact-finding mission, a few months after we released our report, The Tools of Genocide, we actually gave over a draft report to the fact-finding mission of our findings related to the NVC. And the fact-finding mission has a whole section in their report that outlines problems with the NVC and looks in really great detail at how it was a part of the genocide that happened in 2016, 2017, and how it was part of the state security forces kind of systematic way of trying to strip the Rohingya of their identity. Finally, the research is a bit old now. It's from 2019, and there's a lot of new things happening inside Myanmar. So like I said before, the democratically elected government was in place for many years under Aung San Suu Kyi and under the National League for Democracy. But since then, since February 1st of this year, we've still found some incidences of the military actually running NVC campaigns. So right after the military coup, my colleagues and I heard a lot of reports, and we haven't documented it in full because we've just been inundated with other Myanmar coup-related work. The situation is quite dire, as many of you know. But we found incidences in Mungdal particularly. Potentially hundreds of people had to take the NVC from February 2nd to February 4th of this year. And that was a campaign that was led by the military. We have some testimony that said actually the military posts were switched. So they were new military men and came and took over those posts. And the old military were brought to other posts. And those new military personnel actually helped the immigration lead the NVC campaign in Mungdal Township in very early February, right after the coup happened. And also in Butidong Township, we found a number of cases where the NVC is still an ongoing process, even under the military government. So there's a lot more work to be done on how the military government and how General Min Aung Hlaing, as the head of the military, is still trying to strip the Rohingya of their right to citizenship. And we're going to look more into that, but I just wanted to flag it as a potential problem moving forward under the military government. That's about the end of the PowerPoint. I forgot to play the video, so I'm going to play it now at the end of the PowerPoint, and it just looks a little bit about, it interviews some of the Rohingya people in Bangladesh, and it asks them about their perspectives of the NVC. So I'll play that right now. Hopefully the cicadas have also stopped, because I understand they're quite loud. So hopefully they're all good now.
They've stopped. It's perfect.
Okay, can you hear that?
Special habits দিতে বর্মা কমাতে আয় দেশটা নিজের দেশের আর দেশের হয় বলে হয়ে দেন কি এনে কান ডকুমেন্ট হিন ইয়া যাত্তু দিনদিয়া ভাইয়েন দিয়া ডকুমেন্ট দেখাই বেলে তাতো যেতে করে খাই হারিলে ফেলি তাই না আর বেশি সুবিধে না দেখাই রাখি দিলাম বাংলাদেশের মানুষ নয় আর এনবিসি লইরে বিল ও রাজি নাই এনবিসি লন মানে বিদেশিটা আর এনবিসি যদি দদে গিয়ে আনারা জিনোসাইড করি বলে আবারই তার কাম পারমিশন দিয়ে বানাবো আর এনকান জিনোসাইড আর পারমিশন কার্ড দিয়ে বানাবো এনবিসি কার্ড আর জিনোসাইড পারমিশন কার্ড জিনোসাইড রেজিস্ট্রেশন কার্ড বলে বুঝি বুঝতে 3 মাইল হদো মংডুলো গিয়াল 3 মাইল দূরে तो गिरा एमबीसी नॉल तोरा मिसी सारा गलाचो हो माजियो लोडी लो तार बाद टे गुनारी तोरा मता दे एमबीसी ले आबे
Okay, thank you guys very much for listening to me for so long. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for that really amazing presentation. It's a topic I didn't know a lot about. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. We do have questions in the Q&A, but also participants, you're welcome to raise your hand as well. And I'll go through the Q&A in the meantime. I'll read the questions out loud and then feel free to answer them how you'd like. So do you think there will be any efforts of secession or independence from the Myanmar state as a result of these human rights violations? And then if yes or no, why?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk in Myanmar, not necessarily about secession, but about federalism. And a lot of the ethnic communities right now are talking about banding together against the Myanmar military. So right after the coup happened on February 1st, the exiled government many of them were jailed, but some of them fled the country. They started what's called CRHP, and that's basically the alternative government. And that alternative government against the military dictatorship has met with a lot of the ethnic people in Myanmar, and they've said they want to have a potential combined kind of federal democracy moving forward. So if you look at in places in Myanmar in ethnic areas, Karen State, Kachin State, Shan State, a lot of these ethnic communities want federalism in the future. I haven't talked to many people that want kind of to split off or have secession. Rohingya people have talked a lot about going back to Rakhine State. If you talk to them, they want to return. They want to go back to their indigenous homeland. One of their demands is to go back to their original place of origin, so their actual land. Much of it is burned down, and the government has built over it. Now the military is building over it, I guess. but the Rohingya have talked about trying to go into like a safe zone in northern Rakhine State, and for them to have a safe zone in northern Rakhine State. Safe zones, I can understand their rationale for wanting a safe zone in Rakhine State, but there's been a lot of problems with safe zones in the past in other contexts. So I think there could be really big benefits and cons to a safe zone in northern Rakhine State. I'm also not sure. I mean, the Myanmar government would not accept UN peacekeepers or anything like that to operate a safe zone in Rakhine State. I think the best place that the best you would get was Bangladesh as a country that's been really proactive and connected to the international community and international accountability mechanisms. I think the best you'll get is getting UN peacekeepers along the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. If atrocities start happening again, what we saw in 2016, 2017 was shootings along the border. People were laying landmines. The military was laying landmines along the border. So I think that's probably the most it could actually happen that you could have peacekeepers along that border. But succession, I haven't heard much of, at least the Rohingya talk about it much. They've talked a little bit about like trying to create their own unified like leadership globally, because there's so many Rohingya in the diaspora. There's like large hundreds of thousands in Malaysia, in Saudi, in Pakistan, in India. So they've tried to think about like creating kind of like a leadership mechanism for the whole Rohingya global diaspora. So that's been talked about quite a bit in the last few years as well.
Thank you. So the second question is, in a way, has rapid updates in technology and social media, providing almost instant updates, slowed or desensitized the response to the ongoing human rights violations?
I think it's really helped the response. The action, like when the coup first happened inside Myanmar on February 1st and military started attacking its own people, this wasn't counter protest techniques. This was attack on civilian population. You had embassies inside the country, the US embassy, the Canadian embassy, the UK embassy. You had them issue statements quite quickly. You did not see this necessarily happen as quickly when the atrocities were happening against the Rohingya. My colleagues and I at Fortify Rights documented atrocities that took place, killings, genocidal rape, and afterwards we would go meet government leaders in either DC in the United States and embassies in Yangon. Some of the people, unfortunately, that we talked to, they didn't believe a lot of the testimony that we documented and asked for more. So they asked us, do you have photos of this? Do you have video proof of this? And that was a narrative that was pushed for a long time, particularly in Rakhine State, because there was very little connectivity. It was illegal for Rohingya to have a cell phone and to document what was going on at that time. Rohingya people that were citizen journalists, took great risk to document the Atrayan crimes. And there's ongoing processes. There's the independent investigative mechanism on Myanmar. So the fact-finding mission finished, and the IIMM started after that. And their mandate is to collect and preserve evidence. And so they're collecting and preserving a lot of that cell phone and video footage. But the amount of cell phone and video footage that came out of Rakhine State during the genocide and the amount that's coming out now, you have hundreds of videos taken now. My team at Fortify Rights, we're looking at a lot of these videos. We're trying to authenticate a lot of these videos that are coming out of major cities like Yangon and Mandalay of security forces killing people or beating people or arbitrarily arresting people in the streets. And we're trying to find the people that took that video and try to authenticate it. But I'm getting every day dozens and dozens and dozens of videos and photographs. There's easy tools online to kind of look if a video has ever circulated before. So, you see some of that is kind of recirculation of human rights violations that have occurred in Myanmar in other contexts. So when the violence first started, we saw a lot of videos and photographs from Lepidon. There was a crackdown on students in Lepidon, Myanmar. I think it was like 2015 maybe. And we saw videos and photos of that crackdown. And a lot of us were like, wait a second, we've seen some of that before. And we had to kind of go and double check and make sure that was old or new footage. And so I think there's some of that happening. But the government has also blocked internet communication. In Rakhine State, they blocked it from June 2019. In at times, like more than 10 townships in Rakhine State, they blocked it since June 2019. And now are blocking it throughout the whole of Myanmar. So unless you know, a lot of the interviews that we're doing now is direct call-ins, or you know, if people have Wi-Fi, we'll do them on Signal. It's a lot safer. But yeah, connectivity is I think a major benefit to the human rights documentation process. Yeah.
Yeah. And what are the attitudes of the population in Myanmar more broadly? And then they continue, is most of the violence state and military driven, or are there moments of popular violence by ordinary people within communities as well?
Yeah. I don't know if they mean the Rohingya case or the post-coup case, but what you had in the Rohingya case, and then I'll talk about post-coup or most recent coup. What you had in the Rohingya case is you had military, police, border guard forces, immigration, and then you also had civilian proxies of the military. We wrote a report called Long Swords, and it looked at the preparations for atrocity crimes in August 2017. We found that the military had trained ethnic Rakhine people and given ethnic Rakhine people weapons before the August 2017 violence. The military also went to many villages, Rohingya villages in northern Rakhine State, and basically took down fences and would go into the homes and confiscate knives, swords, like hoes to like, you know, it's an agricultural society. A lot of people do different kind of like farming activities. So they would confiscate all that, all those materials, potential weapons, right, to use in places of self-defense if violence was going to take place. So we saw in the Rohingya case that they trained ethnic Rakhine people and gave them weapons on the lead up to the violence, and they also took weapons from the Rohingya people. So you could see this as a major kind of working together with ethnic communities in Myanmar against the Rohingya. That sentiment changed. The Rakhine people are now being attacked. There's a big war that's ongoing between the Arkhan army, which is an Arkhanese Rakhine army. It's not, they're Buddhist, they're not Muslim Rohingya, they're a different ethnic group, but they're living in Rakhine State as well. That army and the Myanmar military have been fighting, and a lot of civilians, Arkhanese, Rakhine civilians, Buddhist civilians, have been caught up in a number of human rights violations. And so I think a lot of Rakhine people sympathize a lot more and show solidarity to the Rohingya because they see, okay, the common enemy is the Decl, is the Myanmar military. It's not the Rohingya people. They're doing exactly what they did to the Rohingya to us now. And you see a lot of the same tactics used. People are charged as terrorists. People are put arbitrarily trumped up charges as terrorists. People are put in prison, arbitrarily arrested. People are killed. People are tortured. So these are a lot of the same processes that happened to the Rohingya before many of them fled to Bangladesh. In the most recent, since February 1st, you've seen a different level of solidarity towards the Rohingya people. You saw this in ethnic communities more, like in places like Karen State and Kachin State, but the general Burman population in Mandalay and Yangon, you see protesters in the streets holding signs saying, "I regret the Rohingya genocide." They tricked us, the military tricked us, like this kind of sentiment. And I think that kind of solidarity building and inter-ethnic solidarity is something in the long term that will have a major effect, even hopefully after the coup, to really build a positive Myanmar, because we were not seeing that kind of solidarity before. So that's really hopeful.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit more about the questionnaire that you used and whether you're developing a survey that could be used for other genocidal case studies?
Yeah, so we just we pre-published that survey for the Tools of Genocide report, but we published the survey in full recently, and we're actually going to put all the open source. We're going to put all the data points online, open source soon. Haven't found a good technical solution to do that, but we just released a report called "Torture in My Mind." It looks at the mental health cost affecting Rohingya people. And under the Genocide Convention, it talks about it talks about physical violence, and it doesn't talk a lot about the provision around mental violence. So that report looks at how potentially mental, basically the eroding away of the Rohingya, like trauma, basically affecting Rohingya people. So that report has it has hundreds of questions and in the survey. So it looks at daily stressors in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. It looks at history of human rights violations, which is some of the data I showed you in Rakhine State. It looks at like hope for the future. So it looks about like if they want to return to Myanmar. It was a fully participatory process. So it was led by 10 Rohingya researchers, 2 Rohingya coordinators, 4 of them were women. These are Rohingya people. Only a few of them spoke English. Most of them spoke just Rohingya. They conducted the interview on cell phones, and they collected and analyzed the data. They translated the English questions into what they call Rohingyalish. And the Rohingya language does not have a formally recognized written form. So there's a couple different written forms, and some use more of an Arabic script, but there's no formal written process. So yeah, that team basically moved forward the research, and it was an amazing process to be a part of. So yeah, we can send around that report. The full survey is in the annex. And also some of the translation is in the annex, especially around like sexual violence. Translation was a major issue, in a lot of contexts. We had to translate very carefully. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that research. It was one of our first quantitative research projects as Fortify Rights. Human rights researchers don't use a lot of quantitative analysis. I think a lot of the time we do mostly just kind of long form interviews. So I think that was really beneficial to our team to take part in and to do, and I think we'll do it more in the future.
That's really exciting. With the next question, you're not living in Myanmar. I'll put that out there. You're not living in Myanmar right now, but they're wondering if you could speak to the general sentiment about of the majority of the population of the Rohingya. And is there much knowledge about the situation and violence? Is it considered genocidal? And is there much support on the ground for them?
Yeah, I think the sentiment on the ground for them is becoming a lot stronger. I think there's a long way to go. Recently, there was something signed by Rakhine, Rohingya, and other ethnicities. It was called the Arkhan Declaration, and that was signed in January of this year. And this basically outlined a number of different points that they all agreed upon, all the different ethnic groups. And that was a major step, I think, in the right direction. So I think support for the Rohingya and recognizing it as a genocide inside Myanmar is definitely something that's is really hopeful, but there's definitely more that needs to be done. Yeah, most Rohingya people that I talk to think the process was genocide, and they use that term. They're super knowledgeable about genocide and about the ways that the military tried to destroy them in whole or in part. Less educated Rohingya won't talk about it in the same terminology that we talk about genocide. But if you read between the lines, they're talking about a genocidal process. The more educated people, that like the man you saw in the video, he obviously was even using the term genocide. he was saying genocide card, even in English. And so a lot of the more educated people, have read histories from the Holocaust, from Rwanda. They understand, I think, a lot of the comparative study that's ongoing. We've written a little bit about Rohingya sentiment, but yeah, I think part of the survey that we did, 495 people, it was a random sampling, by the way. But there's a section, I think, in that survey, if I'm not mistaken, around what did the Rohingya think that the military was trying to like destroy them or something to that extent, one of the questions. So I'll have to pull it up, and we can maybe send that around later. I don't remember what the percentage was that they said, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to circulate that afterwards to everyone.
Yeah.
And we do have another question, a few more questions here. Is there a possibility that the Myanmar army staged this coup d'etat? So the justice process for the justice process for Rohingya, as the army along with the government will be held responsible in the international courts for crimes against humanity and genocide.
Yeah, I guess there's like a number of different cases going on in Myanmar, like accountability cases or mechanisms that are ongoing. First, you have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So that's a case that is between a state and a state. And yeah, I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague to represent the government at the ICJ before. So I think there's, we'll have to see how that case move forward. The lawyers representing the Gambia in that case, they're still collecting evidence. They're still doing the work that needs to be done. And I think the military is now breaking the provisional measures of the ICJ case in major ways. So I think that case is ongoing. The ICC case is related to the Rohingya in full and not to individual perpetrators. So the ICC does not deal with states. And in the ICC case, it's a really interesting case. It looks at the crime against humanity of deportation and other crimes. So they have actually quite a vast area that they can look at. But the OTP, the chief prosecutor at the ICC, she knew that she wouldn't get Myanmar to act right with the ICC and cooperate with them. So she decided to work with Bangladesh, who's a signatory as part of the Rome Statute. And she said, well, all these people have fled into Bangladesh. This is one of the crimes under a crime against humanity is deportation. So let's work with Bangladesh to open a case there. So they're looking into those crimes. The ICC has been on the ground for a number of years in Bangladesh on and off, and they've been collecting testimony, and that case is ongoing. Right before the coup in late 2000, I guess summer of 2020, you had two deserters from the Myanmar military that deserted, and they were the first major deserters to talk about the command structure, the atrocities that went on. These were from major LIBs, light infantry battalions in Myanmar. Those two deserters were crossed from Myanmar into Bangladesh. The Bangladesh government cooperated with the ICC at that time, and they were brought to The Hague a number of weeks afterwards, and their testimonies will be used in some way. We don't exactly know if they're going to be what they consider insider witnesses at the ICC, or if they're going to be also prosecuted as perpetrators, because the violence that they perpetrated was quite horrific. And there's videos of their testimony online, and we also have research online about some of what they did.
Yeah. And are genocide studies developing quick enough to keep up with current and contemporary instances of genocide, in your opinion?
Yeah, I'm not a genocide expert at all. But I think one thing that I think I want to see people quicker at, particularly genocide scholars and academics, because I think they're at the forefront of it as opposed to politicians, is naming the crime when it's happening. I think a lot of the time people are very slow, and it makes the whole process of accountability and prevention a lot harder. You had Rohingya people ringing alarm bells years before people started talking about genocide and crimes against humanity in Rakhine State. And so I think as academics and genocide scholars that are looking at these issues really closely in different comparative ways, I think they're key actually in trying to help the public and help human rights researchers like me be able to make those determinations. I mean, we're not a court, we can't make a legal determination, right? But as advocates and human rights activists, we can call the crime what it is when it's ongoing and say we have reasonable grounds to believe that X, Y, and Z is happening. So I think I would like to see that a lot more. Yeah, I think there's a lot more. I think hopefully there'll be a lot more academic work done with the Rohingya population, particularly like a lot of the diaspora. I haven't seen a lot of work done like there's a large population in Japan of Rohingya people, and I haven't seen a lot done with that diaspora group. There's large population in Australia. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done, and talking to them about what they came from the 1990s, 2000s, a lot of these people. So I think they have a lot of experience about how the state persecuted them. And I think researchers and academics can talk to a lot of these people. They're bilingual and easy to access. So.
And this next question is very similar, but if you have anything else to add.
Yeah.
They say, I'm a student of genocide. I'm wondering what areas of genocide research would you say need more attention in respect to the Rohingya?
Ooh, that's a great question. One area is there's like a digital ID scheme now that was, well, I don't know if it's ongoing now, but right before the coup, there was a digital ID scheme. And I wonder how that digital ID scheme, like what it's like. There's very little online about it, who funds it, what the process is like the application process, what part of the government is implementing it. There's a lot of different questions about like digital ID schemes, and I wonder if the military will use the digital ID scheme to try to strip the Rohingya of their rights, like they've used different kind of physical ID documents, and there's been almost no work on the digital ID schemes and citizenship and identity. So that would be an interesting area. It would take, I think, someone with like some technological knowledge maybe. But yeah, I think that's something that would be really interesting. I think a lot more participatory approaches could be used in actual documentation. So I would like to see that from academics as well. I think that could, I know a woman named Jenny Hedstrom. She works mostly in Kachin State, but she's done a lot of academic articles with Myanmar colleagues and kind of either done like in conversation with or looked at academic concepts through the lens of these people and co-authored with Myanmar people. So I think a lot more of that could happen. I know as academics, you need to have your names published on documents, but I think having a participatory approach is, at least in our experience, like since we did it recently, it was really beneficial. And I think the research process was a lot more in depth because of it, even though it took a long time and you have to do a lot of training. I think it's really beneficial to everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John. This was a wonderful presentation. Yeah. I learned so much, and I think our attendees did as well. The Q&A was great. So again, thank you for waking up so early to join us today. Really appreciate it. And thank you, participants, for joining us today as well. Before we sign off, I will remind you to register for our upcoming next 2 sessions. Our next one is next Tuesday at 2 p.m. where we will be discussing Becoming Human Again, an oral history of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi with Donald Miller, Lorna Toroyan Miller, and Arpi Miller. So be sure to register for that, and we hope to see you there. and stay safe and be well. Thank you so much. Take care.